Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and wherever you are in the world. This evening, our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Rachel Cockerell, and I'll introduce Rachel in just a moment after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you would like to ask into the Q&A facility that you'll find on your screen. As always, we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. There's also a chat facility on your screen, which will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event, and you'll find it in the next couple of days on our website at milim.org.uk, where you'll find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Rachel Cockerell was born and raised in London, where she studied for a BA at the Courtauld Institute and an MA at City University. She's the author of this book, Melting Pot, her first book, which we are going to discuss this evening. Rachel, a very warm Milim welcome to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Now, for those who haven't read your book or heard about it, what's it about?
That question really stumps me. I should have an answer by now, shouldn't I? First question, and you've come out with the most difficult one.
Sorry,
I
apologies.
I originally wanted to write about my grandmother, who was called Granny Fanny, and who's on the front of the book, she died, I think, in the 1980s. But she still talked about all the time. She was sort of, to use a cliche, a larger than life, personality. Or, always getting in arguments with people, hugely sort of outspoken, loud, opinionated. And she came to England as a child from the Russian Empire. She was a Russian Jewish girl, with her sister, and she arrived in England just on the eve of World War One, speaking no English. And she sort of decided, as this girl who couldn't speak to, her friends in when she arrived here, she decided from then on to become more English than the English. And she married a nice, reserved English gentleman, my grandfather, Grandpa Hugh, and sort of wasn't really an immigrant, didn't really sort of carry much of her past with her or pass it on to her children, including my dad. Um, and really, it was this house that my dad grew up in, 22 Mapesbury Road, which a lot of people sort of say, oh, 22 Mapesbury Road, yes, I lived next door to there, or my cousin lived next door, 2 doors down from there. It's this sort of quite notorious road in London. Lots of Jews living there in the 20th century. She lived in this house, Mapesbury Road, at 22 Mapesbury Road, and brought up her 4 children in this house. But she was also living there with her sister, who was more or less her age, who was bringing up her children in this house, and her sister's husband, and also the 2 sisters' mother, my great-grandmother, and her sister were in this house as well. So it was a house with 7 children, 4 parents, and 2 sort of very Russian sort of old women. Some people in my family have described it as a sort of bubble of Eastern European Jewish immigrants in North London. I'm sure there were many such bubbles. But, if you walked into this house in, say, 1948, you would hear Russian being spoken. You might be served a cup of tea with lemon in a sort of very Russian-looking sort of silver cup. You would hear Russian music playing on the gramophone. Really, the only adult in this house who didn't speak Russian was my grandfather, Grandpa Hugh, the reserved Englishman. All the other adults spoke Russian, but they decided not to teach the children Russian because they wanted their own sort of secret language. So I wanted to write about 22 Mapesbury Road, the Mapesbury Madhouse, as it was called. But I started to wonder how and why my family came to England from the Russian Empire in 1914. And that led me to Fanny and Sonia's father, my great-grandfather, David Jockelman. And I started reading a bit about him. Everyone in my family had sort of said, don't bother with him. He was quite a, he was a slightly unremarkable man, didn't do anything of note. He died in 1941. But nevertheless, I persisted, and I started finding a bit out about him. And I found that I found all these things saying Dr. Jockelman was instrumental in the Galveston movement. And I thought, what on earth is this? And eventually I discovered that the Galveston movement was this sort of rebellion from Zionism at the very beginning of the 20th century, which this rebellion was called the Jewish Territorial Organization. And their motto was, if we cannot get the Holy Land, we can make another land holy. And my great-grandfather was the vice president of this organization, and he helped get 10,000 Jews out of Russia and to the slightly unlikely Jewish refuge of Galveston, Texas. So I realized that this story that I wanted to be about this sort of mad sort of North London house post World War II had to start with my great-grandfather, David Jockelman, and what led him away from Zionism and to this thing, territorialism, as it was called, and eventually what made him move to London from Ukraine, where he was living. So, and then there are a few other parts of the story which which I'm sure we'll get into later. But that is really the core of the story is the Jews going to Texas, and then also the Mapesbury Madhouse.
Yeah, you cover both, and as you suggest, quite a bit more. But the book is written in a very different way. I mean, even saying it's written is perhaps the wrong word. In a very different way to anything else, certainly I've seen before. Perhaps you might explain to our audience how you've put it together, and indeed how you came to put a book together in this way. It's most unusual.
I'm sure I'm sure that some people on this Zoom call will be thinking, I've read my fair share of Jewish family memoirs set during the course of the 20th century. Do I really need to read another one? And I hope that this one will be quite a different experience. The whole book is formed of interwoven first-hand accounts or primary sources. So things that I found in letters and diaries and memoirs and newspaper articles and also interviews. And if you think about it, every book of history has this. It has primary sources, but what it has in between is this sort of glue holding it together, these sort of the historian linking one thing to another, or sometimes just paraphrasing the sources altogether. And that's how I originally started writing the book. And I sort of hated my own interjections, these paraphrases, which just felt like it would be more interesting to see the source itself rather than to hear, some woman's some woman's paraphrasing of it. So what I started doing was removing that sort of voiceover as I started thinking of it, and seeing if I could tell the entire story through the eyes of those who were there. And it felt like a bit of a tightrope walk because there was I needed a source for everything. For example, there was one thing that I read in a book early on, a sort of, a book about the Galveston movement saying Dr. Jockelman was persuaded to move to London in 1914, and it had no footnote or anything, and it was by a sort of 21st century historian. So I couldn't put it in because my rule was that it had to be sources from the time rather than secondary. What do they call? What do historians call them? Secondary sources or something. I'm sure someone will correct me. But yeah, so I had this unfootnoted sort of throwaway line saying Dr. Jockelman was persuaded to move to London. And this was a book that is now out of print, and it came out in, I think, 1986 or something. And I tracked down the guy who wrote this book, who is now in his 80s and had done it as a PhD. And I said, "Do you remember where you found the source for that?" And he said, "Absolutely not." But eventually, you know, sort of 3 years later, I was sitting in the Central Zionist archives in Jerusalem, and I found a letter from Israel Zangwill, who I'm sure we'll talk about more, to my great grandfather, saying in 1914, saying, "You must now move to England. Your destiny belongs to England. Bring over your wife and bring over your two daughters. You'll be much happier here than you are in Kiev." And that, you know, that happened all the time, this case of sort of hunting down primary sources and then just slotting them in as if they were missing pieces to the jigsaw. And the result is that when you read this book, it's all these voices from the past telling this story together, almost like a chorus, if that's not too off-putting. And sometimes they contradict each other. I didn't really mind when they contradict each other because it was quite fun, you know, if two people wrote an account of the same thing and they both had different versions, it felt like they were almost squabbling and sort of saying, "No, it wasn't like that, it was like this." One reviewer described it as haunting, which I like, because I sort of felt like I was surrounded by ghosts as I was writing this. Um, and also the other thing to mention is that all the sources are different lengths. So some of them will be one line and some of them will be sort of, you know, 8 pages. So it does, I hope it doesn't feel like, oh, here's a 2-line source and another one, and here's another 2 sentences. You sort of you're sort of carried along by these voices from the past.
The story certainly flows, and on those occasions where there is one line, it's used to tremendous effect. I think I read the style referred to as genre bending, and indeed Jonathan Freedland has written that he thinks non-fiction will be different as a result of this. I wonder if you might share something about the process of curation and how you actually put things together. You know, did you find you were shuffling things around, or was there a very natural order of things falling into place, perhaps?
There was just endless shuffling. I mean, years and years of shuffling. There were a few sort of things that I learnt while writing a book in this style. One of them was if sometimes I would find two descriptions of someone, which, and I loved both the descriptions, but they were almost the same. And I thought, okay, I'll just put both in. And there are a few moments like that where it sort of started to slow down because you were just getting endless descriptions of the same thing, and I realized it was quite self-indulgent. So it was a real case of killing your darlings, and you know, of these two descriptions that I absolutely loved, just, you know, slashing one of them and putting it in the bin. um yeah, and I guess I had this feeling while I was writing it that as I rearranged and rearranged, sometimes the sources would seem to click into place. That phrase was always in my head. We have to make sure they click into place. And it just became very clear to me when they were in the right order. For so long, they were in the wrong order, and it was all a mess and incomprehensible and boring and bad. And then after a long time of sort of revising and tweaking and sort of seeing what I could do, um, they seem to click into place. And there's also this phrase that the writer George Saunders uses, which is sort of work on your writing until it feels jangly with energy. And that was another thing I was sort of looking out for as I was rearranging. Does it have energy yet? Is it sort of sparkling and crackling with energy? And if it wasn't, I knew I was in for another year of rearranging.
But I suppose it's not just rearranging the quotes, but rearranging the actual order of topics or people that each chapter of the book was about. And you've chosen to start the book with Herzl. What was your thinking there? Why is he the beginning of the story? It's a family memoir after all.
Yeah. So this book, which was originally meant to be about 22 Mapley Road, then I realized it had to be about my great grandfather, David Jockelman. And then I realized that actually it had to start with Theodor Herzl, who is completely unrelated to my family in any way. I think my great-grandfather did come across him a few times. They sort of crossed paths. And my great-grandfather was also at some of the early Zionist congresses, but they weren't sort of close friends. But really, Theodor Herzl founding Zionism in the 1890s sort of set this machine into motion, set these cogs turning, which resulted in my family's existence and my existence and my family being English. It's, we talk about sort of butterfly effects. And someone in the book uses this phrase I love, the unresting chain of events. And I can sort of trace back, if it hadn't been for this, then I wouldn't, all these sort of sliding doors moments. But yeah, the book begins with Theodor Herzl as a young journalist in Vienna, founding Zionism, sort of, I think, slightly for ego reasons. I think he sort of thought there's this opportunity here to return the Jews to Palestine, and I could be the first sort of statesman of modern Israel. And therefore I could sort of go down in history books. We think of Herzl as, this sort of figure almost like you would sort of see in a statue or in a history textbook, but he was human just like anyone else. And I think he was slightly in it for himself. And also I was just really captivated by Herzl as a character. Again, I at least thought of Herzl as, this very solemn figure, but actually he could be very sarcastic. He was extremely charismatic and sort of magnetic, both in personality and, also he had this sort of magnetic allure in terms of his looks, very handsome, well dressed. One person says in the book, if you're walking down the street in Vienna and he's coming the opposite direction and you stop to talk to him, you'll sort of do a U-turn and just walk with him wherever he's going, because wherever he's going is undoubtedly more interesting than wherever you plan to go. So he was really just this sort of hugely admired and adored figure in the sort of upper classes of Viennese life. He was a journalist who wrote these sort of funny and interesting essays about his family and about cafe culture. A funny thing that his child might have done. But he saw his own journalistic work as quite trivial. So I was just interested in this man who seemed to have a lot of just a lot of sort of interesting things going on, and also a lot of sort of inner contradictory feelings.
And then we jump to Israel Zangwill, and you mentioned him earlier. What's the connection?
Israel Zangwill was probably much more famous than Theodor Herzl in around 1900. He was, some people have said he was the most famous Jewish figure in the English-speaking world, a huge sort of celebrity, one of the first sort of Victorian celebrities, or one of the first celebrities of the modern era of the 20th century. Beloved for his novels, most famous of which is The Children of the Ghetto, which is, I don't think anyone really reads anymore. And if he was walking around London, say walking down Fleet Street, he would have sort of swarms of admirers all around him. Same in New York, he went on these huge lecture tours of America. He was totally different from Herzl. People called Herzl, he had this sort of otherworldly beauty. And one journalist wrote about Zangwill that he was the ugliest man in the world. And another journalist wrote that he was the worst dressed man in London, which I think was probably true. He would sort of stumble around London with his, a pile of manuscripts under one arm, peering short-sightedly into shop windows, and if he ever sort of strayed into the middle of the road, he would nearly get run over by a horse-drawn carriage. And Herzl visited him when Herzl came to London, just at the end of the 1890s. And Herzl said to him, sort of, will you help me sort of attract the attention of the British Jews, and help, see if they're on board with Zionism. Zangwill described this meeting later. He said, Herzl wrote in his diary, that I asked Zangwill to help me. And Zangwill said in a speech later, this black-bearded stranger dropped from the skies and said, "My name is Theodor Herzl. Help me to rebuild the Jewish state." So he was quite a dramatic kind of guy, always sort of speaking in hyperbole, and got really swept up in Zionism and more or less abandoned his novel writing, and then later rebelled from the Zionist movement and met my great-grandfather.
Now, we meet your great-grandfather sort of fair way into the book. But he doesn't seem to feature a great deal. I mean, this is a book about your great-grandfather, I suppose, and yet he isn't in it very much. Is that because of your primary material rule and that there wasn't a great deal available about him?
Yes, there are some Jewish family memoirs which have a lot of sort of the author speculating about their long lost and their long dead ancestor, and almost sort of being in conversation with them in quite a sort of mystical way, and speculating about I mean, not to name names, but in The Hair with the Amber Eyes, Edmund Duval writes something about like one of his great grandmothers, her dress sort of swishing and the perfume rising from her dress. And I thought, you have made that up. I'm sorry. There was not a letter saying that. That smells of being made up. And I couldn't make up anything or couldn't sort of speculate or anything. So that was one reason why my great grandfather isn't, even though he sort of, in theory, he's at the core of the book, he's not really the main character. But also, I mean, I was really the book Zangwill and Herzl really sort of took over the book, and I didn't mind because they were such compelling characters, and by the end of it I felt like I knew them so well. I felt like they, that I had all these sort of memories of them almost. Um, and I think we have such strict rules about genre. Is it a family memoir or is it a history, and so on. And I liked the idea that this existed somewhere in between the two.
So we come on to the Galveston movement, and Jews from Russia are being settled in Texas. Was there local opposition to this, or was it all wonderfully smooth? And what about the people who were in Galveston? I know there were issues with Galveston, but there were certainly some people there before. Did they mind? Were they happy?
The Galvestonians, as they're called, were very welcoming to these 10,000 Russian Jews who arrived on their shores between 1907 and 1914, speaking only Russian and Yiddish, wearing sort of huge, heavy boots and coats down to the ground, and often with sort of huge, huge beards, um, who seemed almost like aliens from another world. And this word that was often used in the early 20th century, alien immigrants, it was more or less how they felt literally about the Galveston Jews. But there was this idea that the American West and the South were sort of in their infancy and needed immigrants from the old world to build up this great new country. So the Texans and the Americans generally were very welcoming. I think there were no immigration quotas before World War One. So, these huge numbers of immigrant ships would cross the Atlantic. Most of them would go to New York. Especially Jewish immigrants would sort of disembark at Ellis Island and then go not very far at all to the Lower East Side, and there they would stay. And the Lower East Side, as I'm sure many of you know, became really a Jewish ghetto in the early 20th century. And so Galveston was not just a refuge in terms of my great grandfather and Israel Zangwill, who sort of ran this project, but it was quite a convenient solution also for the American Jews who, especially the American New York German wealthy Jews who had been there since the 1880s or the 1890s, and saw these sort of hordes of Russian Jewish immigrants arriving and sort of threatening to overflow New York with Jews, and also perhaps threatening to create a sort of tide of anti-Semitism. And one of them said, "This is a menace that we must not risk." So for them, Galveston was a way of bypassing New York altogether and saving their co-religionists from Russia and from the Russian Empire, and bringing them to America, where they could become, American Jews, this great sort of new species, but not filling up New York anymore because New York was full.
Hmm. And you mentioned that these immigrants had a medical check on arrival. Did many of them not make it in? Did many of them get sent back?
Yeah, this was a real problem. I think the medical checks at Galveston were very strict, and
Mm.
there was a big problem with eye infections in the early 20th century immigration. They would inspect your eyes very closely, and I think it was called trachoma or something similar to that. Um, and if you had any trace of an eye infection, or if you were too old, or if you were infirm, or if you had some other problem, then you would just, as some people said, sort of thrown back to Russia. And so what some immigrants would do on the ship over was shave off their beard or cut their hair. These amazingly sort of wizened Orthodox Russian Jews would just sort of get rid of all their sort of facial trace of being an Orthodox Russian Jew. And one of them said, it's better to have all of you laugh at me on the ship rather than to have the Americans laugh at me when I get there. So already they were sort of beginning this process of assimilation.
And at some point, the experiment, as it was called, finished. What was the problem? Why did it stop?
It's interesting. It finished just a few months before World War One broke out, and people have sort of linked the two together, that, the difficulty of crossing the Atlantic when the war started. But I think it was a few other problems as well. One was, as we just talked about, the risk. It was a higher risk at Galveston of being thrown back into Russia than it was in New York. Another one was that if you think about the journey across the Atlantic, these Russian Jews had to get to Bremen, Germany, in order to board the ship, and then they would cross the Atlantic and sort of go past New York and, onwards down to the Gulf of Mexico, which added, I think, another week or two to their journey. So it was around a month total, and these were not first class passengers by any means. So I think it was quite a grueling journey. And also, once they got to Galveston, something we haven't talked about is they were not allowed to stay in Galveston because there was a fear of creating a new Jewish ghetto, a new sort of Lower East Side of New York. So they were put on a train sort of that day or the next day to Nebraska or Kansas or Illinois or Missouri. So it was their month long journey, which was just the boat, let alone getting to Germany before that, didn't end there. There was another sort of leg to the journey. So I think it was only for the sort of, only for the bravest, and also it sort of involved some risk as well.
Mm. One of the words that appears quite frequently in this part of the book is colonization, which I suppose in recent years has become quite a loaded word, and yet its use in these texts seems almost benign and quite innocent. Do you think the meaning of the word has changed, the interpretation of the word has changed?
This is something I found a lot, and it's something I've never really been asked, so it's so good to talk about it. Um, the word colonization and also the word Zionism, both of them have so much baggage attached now. And reading these sources from 100 or more years ago, they were, as you said, sort of more innocent and more benign. Um, Colonization. So the Jewish Territorial Organization, who sort of founded the Galveston Plan, that had really been their plan B, and their plan A was Jewish colonization, was not dispersal in the Great American West. It was to find a piece of land and create a temporary Jewish refuge there. And they sort of thought at first, what could, surely it couldn't be easier. There must be a land somewhere in this great, this great earth. that is uninhabited but inhabitable. And they slowly learned that that was not the case. And they sort of every government that they approached said it's quite out of the question to have a Jewish state in our country. You know, I think they got quite close with the Australian government, and they sort of thought, you know, give us a piece of the middle of Australia, which is uninhabited. And the Australian government eventually said, no, it's not gonna happen. But you know, I don't think that would have been very nice. There's a reason the middle of Australia is uninhabited, because it's quite hostile. But you know, the Canadian government said the same. They thought of Libya, they thought of Iraq, they thought of Angola, they thought of Paraguay and Mexico, and all these plans sort of fell through for one reason or another. Zhang Will even said, one gentleman approached me with a perfect solution. He said, there's a large and empty piece of land, only it is in Antarctica. So, you know, it was this this realization that colonization was a little trickier than they thought.
The narrative then shifts to New York, and we meet a playwright called M. Joe Bash. I hope I've pronounced his name correctly, or Basher. Tell us more. Tell us more about him.
Yeah. So the part two of the book, part one is really this idea of the melting pot of New York. And it's Zhang. We didn't mention that Zhang Will wrote this play called The Melting Pot, which is the reason people now use the phrase the melting pot. It hadn't, before Zhang Will wrote this play, it hadn't been used as a metaphor for America or for New York. And he wrote this hugely successful play, which is really his legacy. But he was an English Jew, and he was writing this slightly sort of sentimental play about you know, a Jew and a Gentile in New York who cast their differences aside and melt into the melting pot. And then part two, we actually go into the melting pot and we see what it's really like. My great grandfather had a son in his from his first marriage who was a half brother of my grandmother. So he's in theory my great half uncle. I still haven't sort of it's still a challenge for me. He was called Emmanuel Jockelman, and he was born in 1898. And in about 1912, he was sent from Russia, where he lived, to America without his parents. It was sort of, I think the idea was, you know, you'll be better off in America. So he was sent to New York. And when he got there, Emmanuel Jockelman changed his name to M. Joe Bashe. He wrote that he couldn't carry around all those syllables without tripping. So you know, tripping over his own name. And you know, I imagine all the Americans would probably trip over it as well. So he sort of had this pen name, and he became quite a famous experimental playwright in New York, in Greenwich Village, and married one of a young actress in his theater group who was a Southern belle from North Carolina called Doris Elisa Troutman. In 1930, they had a child together, and they were sort of debating who got to name the child. But you know, Doris wanted to name the child, but eventually MJ said, you know, could I name our daughter? And he sort of won this argument. And MJ Bashe named his daughter MJ Bashe II. So MJ Bashe II was born in 1930 and is now 94, and grew up in New York. And part two of the book is about MJ Bashe I in the melting pot, and also MJ Bashe II, who is a sort of product of the melting pot. She's half Russian Jewish, half North Carolinian. So you know, I think she's sort of typical of an American, this sort of quite unlikely mixture. And I was so interested about how these two sort of sides of her seem to sort of compete with each other almost.
And she's still alive. You've met her.
Still alive. I called her up in 2020 for the first time. I had a few family members knew a bit about her, and I tracked down her number. And she said, "Oh, Rachel, nice to meet you. Where should I begin?" and she sort of told me her life story from, from the age of 3 onwards, and she had this, well, she still has this crystal clear memory. She had also met my great grandfather, David Jockelman, who's her grandfather, so she's sort of one generation up from me, and had these memories of David Jockelman, which I find amazing. He was born in 1869, and there's someone alive today who remembers this man, who I sort of thought of as belonging to the past, belonging not to living memory, but to sort of dead history. And she was saying, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll tell you about grandfather."
And you have this character Otto Kahn, who's bankrolling this experimental theatre group with MJO and I think 4 other writers. I wondered from your assessment how successful they actually were, because the comments on their work seem to be rather mixed between gushingly enthusiastic and absolutely terrible.
There were some reviewers who said, this is the most modern writing we've ever seen. This is a sort of new era of, of playwriting. And there was one reviewer who said who said about a play written in 1927, just please, I beg of you, take me back to the old-fashioned methods of 1926. So, it was this, I think they were sort of amazingly sort of ahead of their time. One of them wrote a play about uh, a sort of corrupt politician who speaks who speaks his mind to the American people and says all this outrageous stuff. But the American people like him because they think he's being very authentic. And, another one wrote about, war in Moscow. There were all these echoes of what's going on in the 21st century, written pretty much exactly 100 years ago. So yeah, I think they were ahead of their time, but I've read a few of their plays and I can see why some of the reviewers had a few issues with them. But a real, it was really fun for me to read all these horribly mean reviews from 1927.
Have any of the plays survived? Were you able to find any of the works, the original works?
Yes, I found quite a few of the plays and also lots of sort of letters between all these playwrights. Um, yeah, there's this, I don't know if anyone knows of this website called archive.org, which is a sort of huge online library of digitized works, digitized books and plays and newspapers. And it's most importantly searchable by keyword. So I could type in Mjo Bashe, which is a nice sort of, there are not many irrelevant results for that. And find his plays, find things written about him in, long out of print memoirs and things. So yeah, the sort of the process of finding all this stuff was really, really a good one.
So we then come on to the third part of the book, set in London. Um, how does the family come to be in London? You mentioned their circumstances; they were all living in this large house together. But what was it that brought them to London particularly?
As the Galveston movement is sort of crumbling, facing all these problems, also, the American government gets involved and um, makes life very difficult for the organizers of the Galveston movement. So as it's sort of shutting down in 1914, Zangwill writes this letter to Jockelman saying, "Your future belongs to England. Get out of get out of the Russian Empire and come to England." Zangwill was, if I didn't mention, a sort of, a typical sort of British Jew, who was something very sort of British about him, and he thought England was really the place to be.
Mm.
So Jockelman brings over his wife and his 2 daughters, including my grandmother, and they settle in North London. Um, and then my grandmother and her sister both sort of, become quite English and go to sort of English universities. And then my great grandfather buys this house, 22 Mapesley Road, which is this huge, slightly sort of crumbling house. which is still in the family. I go there every Christmas. And after David Jockman dies, these two sisters decide, well, we may as well just live in this house together with our respective families, which almost become one family. It's, the Cockerells, which is my side of the family, and the Benaris was this other side of the family, my grandmother's sister's family, and they became one sort of slightly dysfunctional, gigantic Russian Jewish family.
It's fascinating to read about them and the sort of almost competition in disorganization between the sisters. But what struck me is one half of this family is Jewish, and the other half really isn't, or at least the mother's Jewish, but the rest of the family are not. And I wondered if there were tensions because of that in the house.
Yes, my grandmother, as I mentioned earlier, married an Englishman called Hugh. Her sister, who was just I think sort of 18 months younger, who was called Sonia, married a Russian Jewish Zionist, called Lova Benari. And I think that was probably the beginning of these two sisters who had led such parallel lives that it was almost as if the two parallel lines were touching. They had grown up together almost like twins, slept in the same bed as children, been almost sort of umbilically attached. And then their lives just forked and sort of started drifting in different directions. And I think it was also, this idea that my grandmother had of becoming more English than the English, whereas her younger sister apparently always seemed more foreign, even though she was younger and therefore had come to England when she was younger. She had sort of more of a Russian accent and was happier to exist as a foreigner in England. And
And
that,
yet it's Fanny who's the one who's married out of the faith, who does the Passover ceremony that you describe so vividly.
yes, Passover in Mapesbury Road was, I think, quite a chaotic affair. Um, usually obviously it's the man who runs it, but there was really no man in my family after my great grandfather died who felt capable of running Passover. So my grandmother, Granny Fanny, the one who decided to be English, also decided to run Passover. That was sort of typical her. Um, and she was sort of fussing around, and the food was burning, and things were sort of spilling everywhere. And my grandfather, Grandpa Hugh, was sitting at the head of the table wearing a bowler hat. And, it's the assorted children and guests and family members all around this table. And I think, yeah, Passover was the one piece of Judaism which Granny Fanny held on to for whatever reason, maybe nostalgia for her own father. Um, who knows? But that was may I've spoken to some Jewish people since sort of learning about this, who say, and I don't know if anyone in this chat agrees, that Passover is sort of the last thing to go. It's the last thing that you cling on to as a Jew or as a Jewish immigrant. Um, and that was definitely the case with her. It was her only sort of vestige of Jewishness.
Interesting. Now we come to another one of the main characters of the Zionist movement, Jabotinsky. How come he appears in the book? What's his connection?
So the fun thing about writing this book was it was a constant interplay of the domestic and the sort of very sort of personal things about my family, and also these, sort of characters from the world stage of history, all sort of woven together. And I think that's how the 20th century was. It was these sort of normal people and these huge figures all sort of coexisting, and um, there was all sorts of sort of causality between everyone. Um, Jabotinsky, my grandmother's sister's husband. So if you remember, my grandmother's sister marries the Zionist. Her so her husband, Lova Benari, becomes sort of enthralled by Jabotinsky, and becomes his personal assistant. And Jabotinsky is one of the few Jewish figures in the 1930s who is warning everyone, the very early 30s, saying, get out of Europe while you can. The only solution to the Jewish problem is mass evacuation. You're all going about your lives as if nothing's happening. You're concerned with sort of the minutiae of daily life, and really you must get out. And he wasn't really listened to, but Lova Benari sort of was trying to help him in this mission to sort of save the Jews of Europe.
And Benari eventually goes to Israel. We'll maybe come to that in a moment. But when you describe the foundation of the Jewish state in 1948, some of the quotations you chose were perhaps not entirely sympathetic to the Zionist movement. I wonder, given that there are probably a vast amount of primary sources on that subject, whether that was deliberate or whether you were trying to balance it, and I've just picked up on the negative ones. What's your take?
I think I was trying, and all the way through the book, to reflect the public discourse at the time, and trying not to be biased or I really honestly didn't have an agenda and wasn't trying to persuade the reader of one side or the other. I just put in the things that struck me the most. And as you say, there are certain quite negative sources about the prospect of founding a Jewish state in Israel. And I really was looking for the sources which sort of made me take a sharp intake of breath. A history book is so easy to just put down and never pick up again. And I wanted the reader to be reading things that they'd never read before, and to be sort of gripped by what people were saying in the 40s. Were there any in particular that you had in mind?
I think this suggestion of there are already people living there and you're going to have to kick them out, whereas they could have stayed, and indeed a lot of people who were living there did stay. But if that's what people were saying at the time, then I can only bow to your judgment, because I haven't made myself as familiar with those sources as you have.
Yeah. Yeah, it was purely what I was finding at the time. And I hope that chapter does feel like a debate, and feels like this sort of people sort of in discussion with each other
Not
about.
very much so. Yeah, there are certainly different opinions there. How did it work out for the strand of your family that went to live there? Because they were there fairly early fairly early on following the establishment of the state, weren't they?
They were there in I think 1951 was when the whole family moved there. That whole sort of side of my family moved there. And again, when they went there, I wanted to represent not some idealized version of what it was like, but the truth of what it was like. My great uncle, I suppose, Lova Benari, his daughter, who is still alive, who was born in 1935, said that he had this great dream of this country that he'd been dreaming of all his life, and obviously it was just a dream. This ideal vision you have of something. I'm sure everyone here knows about this idea of Jerusalem syndrome, where you become so obsessed with this idea of Jerusalem. I think he probably had a bit of that, and reality never matches up. He was disappointed in a few ways, but also, I'm sure he also felt like he had come home, and that Israel was really his home, and he worked for the rest of his life at the Jabotinsky Institute, So he was, yeah, his two great passions were Jabotinsky and a Jewish state in Israel. So he sort of spent the rest of his life, fulfilling both of those passions.
So you've written on the sleeve notes that your research took you all over the world: Texas, Ohio, New York, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. We have a question from Anthony Green. He says, presumably you visited Texas and Galveston. Did you meet any descendants of the immigrants, and what was their take on their family's history?
I did. I met quite a few descendants. I I during my research, I think probably in 2020, I found an article about a Galveston immigrant, and I found contact details for her grandson, and I gave him a cold call, and I said, I'm writing this book about Galveston, and he very kindly did not slam the phone down on me, as I think most people do with a cold call, but he told me about his grandmother, and afterwards he sent me an interview that someone had done with her in the 70s. She had come to America as a sort of 19-year-old in 1912. So she was, an old woman by this point. And I had been wondering before this, I wonder what Galveston immigrants sounded like after they had been in America a bit of time and learned English. Because really what they must have is a Russian Texan accent,
Mm.
especially if they don't come as young children. And I heard this tape recording of a Galveston immigrant with the most wonderful Russian Texan accent I've ever heard. And then later I went out to America to do research, and this guy said, come and visit me on my ranch. So we had a little sort of reunion of quite a few Galveston descendants, as I call them, and me, a non-Galveston descendant, on this Jewish ranch in Texas. And I went and rode horses with him, and he showed me all sorts of photographs, and I spoke to all these amazing Galveston Jews. So yeah, there are, if you think about it, 10,000 Jews originally went there, and their descendants must number in the hundreds of thousands now, and they're all across the American West. So generally, if a Jewish person is in the American West, many of them have some link to Galveston and to the Galveston movement.
Interesting, interesting. So real Jewish cowboys, I
Real Jewish
suppose.
cowboys.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about the editing of the book. I think I recall you had to cut the book down quite a bit. So how was that? And was there anything that was left out that you sort of with hindsight think might have been better left in?
No, because I think you never regret cutting something out. There were a few that I found endless amazing descriptions of Israel Zangwill. Journalism in the early 20th century was just wonderful and delightful. Journalists had no hesitations about being as rude as they wanted about people. They
Mm.
also wrote beautifully, never using cliches, never using sort of garbled or boring language. So I just had, and also, there were all these local newspapers um, with sort of, correspondents who'd be writing back to their local newspaper. So I had these endless sort of pen portraits of Zangwill and also of Herzl. Um, and I had to sort of choose which ones could go in and which ones, as I was saying earlier, sort of felt repetitive or felt like they were slowing the story down.
Mm.
I suppose there are a few descriptions of Zangwill which I had to cut out, but they still sort of have a place in my heart. There's one where, for example, someone was interviewing him in Washington, D.C., and he was sitting in an armchair, but because he was so sort of gangly and had such long arms and legs, he couldn't get comfortable in the chair. And I imagine a sort of Quentin Blake illustration of the BFG sort of flinging his legs over the one side of the armchair, and then that wasn't working. And it just, I mean, I sort of related to that because I could never really get comfortable in a chair. I'm 6 foot and lots of arms and legs. And there was another one where he was asked to make a speech at a dinner party, and he sort of made such a funny speech that everyone was falling about laughing. It had been this slightly formal, sort of staged dinner party up until that point. And all these sort of slightly sort of buttoned up people around the table were suddenly sort of roaring with laughter. And Zangwill had this look in his eyes as if to say, why all this hilarity? You know, making these very dry jokes and not really laughing. It was all just a big game. So I suppose there are, you know, there are just wonderful little moments which did not make it into the book because better ones did make it into the book. And I just have to have those just for me, really.
We have a question from Jay Prosser, who's also written a family memoir. Indeed, he was our guest a few weeks ago, and he says a family memoir typically changes the person writing it. Do you feel changed by writing this book? Who was she at the completion of the project? So has the book changed you? Has writing this book changed you?
Definitely. I feel sort of more, as I sort of said earlier, more sort of surrounded by ghosts than I felt before. I feel surrounded by Granny Fanny and by Jockelman, and particularly by Zangwill, and also a bit by Herzl, and by Mjo Bashe the first. Um, Whereas I think up until I started this book, I sort of went through life thinking the main character is me, and the most important time is now. Who cares about the past? You know, it's all very dusty, and they didn't realize that they were living in the past, and now we're living in the present, and this is it. It's all been a lead up to this now. And now I sort of realized that human generations are more like sort of apartment blocks where each generation is a level, and you're just on one of those levels, and there's your descendants below you and your ancestors above you, and you think your level is the only level there is and the sort of main level, and you're just one in, you know, many levels. um some people have asked me whether I feel more Jewish now, and I am still undecided about that. I still feel like a bit of a fake Jew, as I call myself, because I only have one Jewish grandparent, and it's through my dad's side, so it's my dad's mother. Um, so you know, I spoke to an Orthodox Jewish woman once who I told her I was a quarter Jewish, and she said, "Oh no, you're zero Jewish. Sorry about that." So, and I don't know, I think I feel more of a sense of what I've lost and what I don't have through sort of melting into the melting pot. Um, you know, seeing what, you know, even my dad grew up with Passover, you know, albeit a slightly sort of wacky Passover, but that he didn't pass down to me. So that last remnant of Judaism in his line of the family ended with him, and all he passed down to his his children was matzahs and gefilte fish balls, neither of which are close to my heart.
No, matzahs are at least a start with Passover. I mean, it's it is a little bit. Um, we have a question from Martin Morris. How long did it take you to write the book, considering how much research you had to do?
I started it in mid 2019, and I think I finished it in mid 2022. But then once I got an agent and an editor, they both had more changes to make and bits to add and bits to take away. So I never had that feeling of writing the end and thinking that that's it, I'm done. Sort of I can put my feet up now. Even sort of the days before the book was going to print, there were changes that we were making.
Mm.
So it came out in February this year, and I started it in 2019. So the process was 5 years in total, but probably about 3 years of work.
Actual work. And what's next? Are you going to write something else, or
I think
something
I'd like
similar, something different?
I think I'd like to write more in this style of interwoven
Mm.
um, eyewitness accounts. I think it's a style that is applicable beyond Russian Jews going to Texas. I sometimes find myself reading history books and thinking this could have been done in my style, or
Mm.
I'm sure other people have done this before, but in this particular style, because you sometimes, especially if you have such a rich sort of archive of source material, you don't actually need the sort of filling in the gaps between each quotation. And some books, I'm sure you've all found this, that when you're reading them, the best bits are the quotations, and the paraphrases you could sort of take or leave. So I'd love to sort of prove to everyone that this way of writing is more versatile than just 20th century Jews.
It reminds me in a sense of a music video, which is cutting every few seconds to keep your attention. And because the voice is changing every sort of few seconds of your reading, it really does hold your attention. You don't find you're drifting off. It's very, very much imminent and really grips you while you're reading it. So I found it worked really well. It was a book that at no point did I think, oh, this is a slog, I've got to get through it. It really was a joy to read every page. So thank you for being our guest. This book, highly recommended. It's available from all good booksellers. And to say thank you, I'll be sending you some of my photographs of Israelis, which I hope you like, reach you in the next few days.
Thank you.
So just a few words about our upcoming program before we leave you. Next week, on the 16th of December, we've got Milim regular Yankee Fachler back. This time he's talking about the dogfight over Sinai, the day Israeli Spitfires shot down 5 RAF Spitfires. We're then off for a week. But then on the 30th of September, we're back with author Jono Ellison. He's written 2 books, one about a world record-breaking taxi ride, which went all around the world, including some interesting times in the Middle East, and one with a more local flavour, which is about a walk along the River Wharfe. And he and I will be chatting about both of those books. 6th of October brings Professor Rosa Freeman of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism for a special talk entitled United Nations, Israel and the 7th of October. And we have much more in the pipeline. To book tickets and for details about other future events, as well as to see recordings of this and other past events, please visit our website at milim.org.uk. You can sign up for our newsletter there, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All our online events are free, but you can, if you wish, make a small donation. There's a link coming up in the chat, or you'll find it also on our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Rachel Cockerell, once again. Thank you so much, Rachel. It really has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Next time, till then, stay safe. See you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.